You've spent your whole life building a version of yourself, a story that makes sense, a name that fits, a structure that feels solid. You say, "This is who I am." But one day something shifts, and the structure you built begins to shake. The image that once felt unbreakable suddenly feels fragile. You start to see cracks in the foundation. Small, subtle fractures that spread faster than you can hold them together. You used to think identity was truth. Now you realize it was only stability, a set of routines, beliefs, and stories you told yourself to feel safe. The ego doesn't like uncertainty. It wants control, direction, purpose. It wants to know. But when those certainties begin to crumble, you're left face to face with something the ego can't explain, the feeling that you no longer know who you are. And this is where the terror begins. Because the ego doesn't die quietly. It fights, clings, bargains, resists. It will do anything to stay intact. But what's really happening isn't destruction. It's revelation. What's falling apart isn't you. It's the mask you mistook for you. The shattering of self-certainty is not a failure of identity. It's the beginning of truth. It's the moment your mind realizes it has never been the whole story. And in that collapse, in that deep, disorienting silence, something greater than the ego begins to awaken. Awareness itself. Sign number 1. Your identity feels unstable. You wake up one day, and the person you thought you were doesn't feel real anymore. The name still belongs to you. The memories are still yours. But the sense of "this is me" begins to dissolve. You start to notice how much of your identity was built from repetition. The roles you played, the expectations you met, the version of yourself that made sense to others. And now, none of it fits. You walk through the same world, but it feels like you're wearing someone else's skin. The things that once defined you, success, opinions, habits, preferences, lose their weight. You say the same words, but they sound unfamiliar. You do the same things, but they no longer mean anything. This is the first fracture in the ego's armor. The moment you realize yourself was a construction, carefully maintained to feel consistent and safe. But consistency isn't truth. It's comfort disguised as identity. The mind starts to panic. It asks, "If I'm not who I thought I was, then who am I?" There's no answer. Only silence. And that silence feels like falling into nothingness. Yet this nothingness is not your end. It's the space between who you were and who you're becoming. It's the pause before reintegration. The ego resists because it wants definition. But identity is not a solid structure. It's movement, not memory. It changes with awareness. And when the false layers fall away, what remains is something raw, unpolished, and honest. Not a role, not a title, but a living awareness observing itself. You are not losing yourself. You're losing the story that kept you from seeing who you truly are. Sign number 2. Your beliefs start to crumble. Everything you once believed in, about life and about others, about yourself, starts to lose its certainty. The ideas that once gave you meaning now feel paper-thin. What used to feel obvious now feels questionable. You begin to see how many of your beliefs were not chosen. They were inherited, absorbed, repeated. They gave you order, not truth. They told you what to think, not how to see. And now, that scaffolding begins to collapse. You can no longer take comfort in the way things are. You start asking questions that don't have easy answers, questions that leave you suspended in ambiguity. At first, it feels like betrayal. Your own mind turns against what once anchored it. The ego cries out, "If I can't believe in this anymore, what do I have left?" The answer, nothing familiar. But that's the point. Beliefs are structures the ego builds to avoid uncertainty. They make you feel safe, not awake. And when those beliefs fall, the ego experiences it as death, because the world no longer revolves around its definitions. This collapse is not punishment. It's purification. It's the psyche shedding its borrowed convictions so that genuine understanding can emerge. In this space, everything feels disoriented. You don't know what's real anymore. But this confusion is sacred. It's the clearing of illusion. It's the destruction that makes room for truth. The mind wants to rebuild immediately, to find new certainty, to form another belief to replace the one that fell apart. But if you can resist that urge, if you can stay in the uncertainty, you'll begin to see something extraordinary. That truth doesn't need to be believed. It only needs to be seen. And that vision, the raw, direct perception of reality without filters, is the beginning of true freedom. Sign number 3. You confront your own contradictions. There comes a moment when the mirror turns against you, not the one on the wall, the inner one. You start to see everything you've hidden from yourself, the inconsistencies, the masks, the quiet manipulations you used to call good intentions, the pride that dressed itself as humility, the fear that wore the costume of control. For the first time, you can't unsee it. You can't explain it away, justify it, or bury it under logic. You stand in front of your own reflection and realize you are both the hero and the hypocrite, both the victim and the cause. This is the ego's breaking point. It wants to be pure, consistent, righteous. But the psyche is not clean. It's layered, paradoxical, alive. When you meet those contradictions head-on, the illusion of a single, polished identity begins to dissolve. You feel disgust, shame, confusion. You ask, how could I be both of these things? The answer, because you are human, complex, divided, incomplete. Everything you rejected in yourself still lives within you, waiting to be seen, waiting to be integrated. This confrontation is brutal. The ego trembles, desperate to defend the old image. But the moment you stop fighting what you see, something powerful happens. Honesty takes over. Honesty doesn't comfort you. It strips you bare. But in that exposure lies real strength. Because now you're no longer pretending. You're no longer editing your own truth. You begin to understand Jung's most unsettling insight, that the person you've been denying is not your enemy. It's the part of you that carries everything you've refused to become. Integration begins when you stop choosing sides within yourself, when you allow contradiction to exist without collapse, when you can say, I am both, and still stand in your own presence. Only then does the mask truly fall, and beneath it you find not perfection, but wholeness. Sign number 4. Control becomes impossible. There was a time when you believed you were in control of your plans, your image, your direction, your future. You built routines, systems, goals, a carefully managed life. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. Something begins to slip. Events no longer obey your logic. People don't respond the way they used to. Even your own thoughts stop cooperating. The harder you try to steer, the more violently the wheel pulls back. You start to realize control was never real. It was a comforting illusion, a story the ego told itself to feel safe in an unpredictable world. Now that illusion is breaking. The mind resists. It panics. It scrambles to tighten its grip. But life keeps moving without asking for permission. The collapse of control feels like failure. It feels like weakness. But it's neither. It's the dismantling of the false belief that you are the center of everything. This is the moment the ego begins to unravel, because its power depends on control. When that power fades, the ego starts to fade with it. You'll feel frustration. You'll feel helpless. You'll feel small. But underneath all that, you'll also feel something the ego never allowed you to feel before. Reality. Reality doesn't need to be managed. It doesn't bend to your will. It just is. And when you stop trying to dominate it, you start to see it clearly. Not as an enemy, but as a mirror. This is where humility is born. Not the kind you wear to appear noble, the kind that comes from realizing you were never truly in charge. Control was a cage. Losing it feels like chaos. But what it really is freedom. Because once you stop trying to command life, you begin to participate in it. And in that surrender, you don't disappear. You finally begin to exist. Sign number 5. Emotional intensity spikes. You thought you were calm. You thought you were composed. You thought you had your emotions under control. But when the ego begins to die, all that control collapses. Everything you buried, every suppressed feeling, every quiet resentment, every unspoken fear, rises to the surface at once. It's chaos inside. You feel anger, sadness, emptiness, and despair, sometimes all in the same breath. There's no rhythm to it, no logic to hold on to. You swing between numbness and overwhelm. The ego hates this. It wants clarity, stability, a clean emotional narrative. But what's happening now is not disorder. It's release. For years, the ego has acted as a dam, containing what it couldn't understand. Now that dam is cracking, and everything long denied begins to flood through. This is not regression. It's exposure. It's the psyche cleansing itself of distortion. At first, you'll mistake this intensity for failure. You'll think you're losing it. But you're not. You're feeling it. For the first time, you're not filtering or editing what moves through you. You're allowing it to be seen, to be known, to be felt. The ego will call it weakness. It will demand you pull yourself together, return to control, rebuild the wall. But if you can resist that command, you'll notice something beneath the storm. A strange clarity. Every emotion that once terrified you now carries information. Anger shows where you betrayed yourself. Sadness reveals what you've outgrown. Fear points to what's asking for attention. This intensity is not the end of stability. It's the beginning of depth. You are learning to stand in the fire without flinching. You are learning to let emotion move through you without becoming it. And in that movement, in that flood of everything you once resisted, something begins to purify. Not your feelings, but your capacity to feel. When the ego finally breaks under the weight of emotion, the heart begins to speak for itself. And it doesn't whisper, it roars. Sign number 6. Time and purpose feel distorted. The clock still ticks, but you no longer feel its rhythm. Days blur together, weeks dissolve, and the sense of progress, the constant need to move forward, suddenly loses its grip. You used to chase meaning in milestones. The next goal, the next accomplishment, the next validation that you were on track. Now, none of it feels real. The path you built disappears beneath your feet, and for the first time, there is no clear direction. Only stillness. You begin to sense that time itself was part of the illusion, a way the ego measured its worth. Every second once served a purpose, to prove something, to become something. But when the ego dissolves, that timeline collapses. You're no longer rushing to arrive anywhere. And that feels terrifying, because without a goal, without a purpose to chase, you confront the silence beneath all your striving. The ego calls it wasted time, but what's really happening is deeper. You're being stripped of artificial urgency. You're learning to exist without justification. You're learning to be. This is the void between identities, a blank space the mind cannot categorize. It feels like nothingness. But in that nothingness lies pure potential. The mind resists it because it wants momentum. It wants to fill every gap with movement. But growth is not always expansion. Sometimes it's suspension. Sometimes it's the collapse of every illusion of progress so that genuine evolution can begin. You may look around and think you've lost everything, your drive, your clarity, your passion. But this disorientation is not regression. It's recalibration. It's the psyche reordering itself without the false anchor of ambition. Time slows. Purpose dissolves. And in the quiet that remains, you begin to sense something the ego could never grasp. That life was never moving toward meaning. It is meaning, unfolding moment by moment, whether you chase it or not. Sign number 7. A new perspective begins to form. After the chaos, after the collapse, after the silence, something begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. You start to notice small moments that feel different. You're still here, but the you that's observing feels lighter. There's space between thought and reaction, space between emotion and identity. You begin to see instead of become. For the first time, awareness stands on its own. You no longer need to defend every thought or protect every feeling. They rise and fall like waves, and you simply watch them move. This isn't detachment, it's clarity. You see how much of your suffering came from over-identifying with passing states: anger, pride, fear, ambition. They ruled you because you thought they were you. Now, you recognize them as visitors. The mind still speaks, but its voice no longer drowns you. It becomes background noise, an echo rather than a command. And in that quiet, a new perception begins to form. You see patterns where you once saw problems. You sense depth where you once saw emptiness. You realize that awareness doesn't need a name, a role, or a story to exist. This is the rebirth, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow return to presence, a way of living that isn't ruled by fear or egoic validation. You no longer chase meaning, you participate in it. You no longer perform existence, you experience it. This perspective isn't something you control. It emerges on its own, like light filtering through what once was solid stone. And when you look back, you see that nothing external really changed. The world is the same. The difference is how you see it. What once looked like chaos now appears as movement. What once felt like loss now feels like release. What once terrified you now feel like truth. The ego fought to survive, but awareness didn't need to win. It only needed to wake up. And now it has. Because this process feels like dying. Not in body, but in everything you thought made you you. The ego does not know how to survive without control, without identity, without its familiar narrative. So when those begin to fall apart, it interprets it as annihilation. It screams for stability, for something to cling to, anything to rebuild the illusion of I. But the more it clings, the faster it unravels. You feel it as fear that comes from nowhere. A cold, hollow panic, a sense that the ground beneath you has vanished. Because in a way, it has. The ground was never solid. It was belief, repetition, memory. Now, without it, you are face to face with raw existence itself. And the mind cannot comprehend it. It has no reference for being without structure. It calls it death, but it's not death. It's exposure. It's reality without the filter of ego. This is why people run from awakening. Not because it's unpleasant, but because it's unmanageable. You can't control it. You can't predict it. You can't name it. You can only surrender to it. The terror comes from realizing that every identity you've ever worn was temporary. Every certainty you ever held was conditional. And yet, beneath all that collapse, you're still here. Something is watching the fall, something that isn't breaking with it. That's what frightens the ego most. The discovery that you exist beyond it. That awareness remains untouched, even as every illusion burns away. The fear you feel is not proof that something is wrong. It's proof that something false is dying. And when you stop running from that fear, it transforms into understanding. Because fear, at its core, is simply resistance to truth. And when truth finally enters, it doesn't kill you. It frees you. When the dust settles, when the noise fades, when everything false has fallen away, what's left is silence. And in that silence, something begins to breathe again. It's not the old self coming back. That one's gone. It's something deeper, something that was always there, waiting behind the noise, the masks, the control. For the first time, you're not pretending. You're not performing. You're not building yourself to be understood. You're simply here, present, aware, unguarded. The ego's death didn't erase you. It revealed you. It stripped away the imitation so that what remains could finally be real. You no longer crave approval. You no longer chase certainty. You no longer need to prove your worth through motion or achievement. You understand that being is enough. That awareness itself is meaning. You still have thoughts, emotions, and desires, but they no longer rule you. They move through you, and you let them go. You don't cling to identity like a lifeline anymore. You use it as a tool, flexible, temporary, transparent. This is what freedom feels like. Not euphoria, but equilibrium. Not perfection, but authenticity. You begin to live in truth, even when it's uncomfortable. You begin to speak honestly, even when it costs you the image you once protected. There is no triumph here, no grand finale, just quiet strength, just awareness, just the simple realization. You were never the role you played. You were the consciousness behind it all, watching, learning, awakening. And now that you've seen through the illusion, you can never return to who you were. You've outgrown the mask. You've outgrown the need to be anything other than what you are. Ego death was not an ending. It was the reset. The moment illusion burned, and truth took its first breath. So you stand here, bare, uncertain, but real. And for the first time, you no longer fear the unknown. Because you've met it. And you've realized the unknown was always you. There's a silence that follows every ending. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding. After the collapse, after the fear, after the long unraveling of everything you thought was you, you begin to sense something subtle. A quiet pulse, a steady awareness that doesn't demand, doesn't explain, doesn't perform. It simply is. You realize that nothing essential was ever lost. Only the layers that pretended to protect you, the false certainty, the borrowed beliefs, the endless control, all of it had to burn. Because what's left after fire is what cannot be destroyed. Now, the world feels different. Colors seem sharper. Time feels slower. Not because life changed, but because your perception finally did. You're no longer chasing meaning. You're living it, breath by breath.